Why are we always going back to John Smith again and again?
Come on, let's go talk about it. Hello and welcome back. Here we're taking another look at our series Going to the Source, and we're specifically looking at our sources today. It has been noted that we do seem to go to Captain John Smith quite a lot, but not exclusively. We'll explain why we lean on Smith a bit in just a moment, but we do look at a lot of other sources. And really, I mean, all the sources we can. I mean, use everything available. But just to look at a few, we have, to start with here, William Strachey, for instance, Fort Secretary. At one point, he gives us, an in-depth account of the wreck of the Sea Venture, and his history of travel into Virginia Britannia it's fairly thorough, but he doesn't get his works published right away. We see his true reportory of the wreck and redemption of Sir Thomas Gates, on Bermuda. It's not published until 1625, after the dissolution of the Virginia Company, as part of Purchas, his pilgrim, Samuel Purchas, basically put together an anthology. He collected a huge number of first-hand accounts, put them all together and published them in 1625 in a 4-volume set. And it is worth noting that Purchas himself never came here. He is just collecting other first-hand accounts. And also worth noting that he, in preparation for that publication, did some editing himself. So even as modern historians, we have to be, careful with, modern editing of historical sources and that kind of thing. There's historical editing of historical sources as well. So while Purchas, his Pilgrims, is an excellent place to get started, if we can get to the source material that Purchas collected, we prefer to, because it's still more intact. Right. Some of those things are unfortunately no longer available, but we try to get to the original source when possible. George Percy, he is sort of interim governor numerous times, one of the garrison commanders here, off and on over the early years, and he writes fairly extensively as well. Observations gathered out of a discourse of the plantation of the southern colony of Virginia in 1606. Once again, not published by Percy, but by Purchas in 1625. And a true relation of the proceedings and occurrences of Mama, which have happened. It's a long title. He writes about this up into 1612. It does not ever actually get printed. It doesn't get published until 1922. So the manuscripts are just sitting around. Maybe one or two people read them over the years, but they weren't publicly available until 1922. So the vast majority of people had no idea. Henry Spelman, young man who came to Virginia early on and served with the Virginia Company. He writes Relations of Virginia, but it doesn't get published until 1872. So again, the manuscript sits around for a long time, but does not get published until the 19th century, and that's fairly common. We see during that period that real focus on the founding of the nation, right? The country was coming up on 100 years of independence, and people were really into the origins of the country. So there's big hype about early colonial period, essentially in the latter portion of the 1800s. But again, Spelman's account, and which is a nice account because he's not one of the high-ranking guys in charge. He's just a young man out of the common classes. Or at least, he's in common station here in Virginia at any rate. But again, not available until 1872. John Clark, captured by the Spanish. He's an English ship's pilot, gets captured by the Spanish in 1611, and gives at least 2 depositions about goings-on in the colonies while he's in Spanish hands. And those are recorded, filed away, and then not again becoming available for public consumption until sometime we think in the 1930s. Again, there's all these sources out there. They're sitting on a shelf somewhere, right? And they're not available publicly until they're getting published much later on, as historians are sort of rediscovering them. Alexander Whitaker, he's one of the ministers here, Reverend Alexander Whitaker. Good news from Virginia, sent to the Council and Company of Virginia, resident in England, published by the company in 1613, so that was actually available, but it's nowhere near as extensive a writing as some of the others. It's certainly a very useful resource, but it's only that, his one take on it. So again, it's a limited insight. Susan in Kingsbury, a historian, compiler of Virginia Company records, right? She collected everything she could get her hands on. So the actual Virginia Company records, a lot of these personal discourses that ended up in the Virginia Company records and elsewhere. She published the company's records from various collections in 4 volumes between 1904 and 1935. The publication brought together a lot of things that had been dispersed all over the place, and a lot of previously unavailable, unstudied documents associated with the Virginia Company in London. But again, it's not until the beginning of the 20th century that actually becomes available for public consumption. So when we look at Captain John Smith, not only did he get a broadside published while he was still in Virginia, unbeknownst to him, he sent a report back and it ended up getting published right away. So he's one of the first words that the public hears about Virginia. The Virginia Company said, "All right, yeah, let's print this and get this out there." So he's kind of the first public resource on what's going on here. He is also very extensive. He writes numerous volumes, right? He's got whole books, which includes all of his adventures all elsewhere in the world. But at the time, as he was publishing them, put out 3 volumes just about Jamestown. Now, it's mostly just kind of the same, different versions of the same basic set of accounts. But he outlives most of his contemporaries. He outlives most of the other kind of top-ranking officers that had been involved in the founding of the company itself. He outlives the Virginia Company. And so as he is publishing his accounts, when he publishes his recommendations, based on my experience as Captain John Smith, we've got three separate videos about his lists of recommendations. That's in 1624. It's the same year the Virginia Company is being dissolved by the Crown. He outlives the company. He outlives most of his contemporaries. There's nobody to argue with his version of the story, essentially. He gets to tell it the way he wants to tell it. He gets to decide how his role in the forming of the colony is going to be perceived, without any kind of risk of argument from anyone. He was the only one available, or at least broadly available, for public consumption for so long. And he's so prolific that he's a really easy go-to source, at least when you're getting started. And because so many of these sources sat for so long, some of them are incomplete. Some of them, again, they come to us through numerous generations of historians who have edited and edited and edited. So again, they're not always as intact as we want them to be. You can definitely find heavily edited versions of Smith's accounts as well, but you can also get Smith's works more or less unaltered still. So he is a very useful resource in that regard, and to the historian that just wants something quick and thorough, reasonably thorough, That's a very tempting resource. But again, we do try to diversify who we're leaning on with these historical sources as much as we can, because obviously one person's unchallenged perspective does not a thorough study of history make. But this is why we end up, again, coming back to John Smith over and over again. There's a lot. There's a lot that Smith wrote. He was the earliest, and again, sort of unchallenged by anyone else from the period. Now, as we move forward in the series, obviously we're going to keep digging, continue to try to find as wide a variety of sources we can and lean on them as much as we can. You're probably going to hear at least a couple of more times from Captain John Smith. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thanks for joining us today. Tune in next time. We'll see you then.